Okay, good evening and thank you all for coming. So, the last talk in our consciousness studies series, we started in September and we covered quite a lot. So I would like to recap a bit the things that we've been talking about. I started with talking about how mathematics is the blueprint for reality. So science is basically you take a chunk of reality, you encode it as mathematical equations, you do the math according to the formal system, and you then make a prediction, you translate it back, and this is kind of like the template of what science is basically doing in physics. So math as the machine code of reality, which is kind of weird because you can do math in a dark room with your eyes closed in your mind and kind of the relationship to the outer world. This was what Eugene Wigner was wondering about, the theoretical physicist who was like, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences. And then we also talked about kind of this, complexity science. So physics deals a lot, so first of all it deals with the non-living and the non-conscious, but then it kind of doesn't do such a good job when things start to get complex in terms of interaction. So if you want to model a swarm of birds, it's really hard if you're trying to solve 50 or 100 differential equations, but what it turns out to be, it's easy if you do it from an interaction point of view, if you do it algorithmically. So you're basically simulating the evolution of the system, and you're not actually trying to sort of solve equations. So this is where this complexity science sort of came in, that it's what looks like complexity is actually often the rule of very simple rules of interaction. And this is as an example, I mentioned a couple of times Stephen Wolfram. So 2002, he was a new kind of science. Hey, so he's a physicist. He was super clever and still is. So even his papers that he wrote is I think a 17-year-old are still referenced today in cosmology and I think in quantum physics. And he was hey, physics went wrong the day they started to do mathematics 300 years ago with Newton. And we should, it's a computational thing. We should think about it in terms of computation. Everyone ignored him. 2020, he brought out another book, the project to find the fundamental theory of reality or something. And now he does hypergraphs, updating in kind of abstract space. And he claims that, look, the structures we have here, they look very much like general relativity or quantum behavior. And now slowly, physicists are yeah, maybe we should listen to Stephen. And he's also kind of talking about how consciousness fits into this. And so kind of we have the impression that science understands a lot, and it does, it's amazing, we have all the technology, but there's so many existential foundational problems, what is time? Is space-time emergent? What's happening at all this crazy weird thing happening at the quantum level we talked about many times. So there's a lot of stuff which makes absolutely no sense from a rational common sense perspective. And this is something which goes into philosophy more. And as I mentioned, consciousness was ignored in academia till the beginning of the 90s, where they were there's whatever, this is not very relevant, which seems weird because that's the only thing we kind of exist in as beings. And then in the philosophy part, it was this tension between physicists and philosophers, where in the beginning, the pioneers of quantum physics, they were very open to engaging with these sort of fundamental weirdness of reality, wave-particle duality, measurement problem, superpositions, entanglement later on. But then kind of the next generation came along and they were hey, shut up and calculate, just forget about this philosophical arguments and just do the math, do the equations. And they work, and you can understand stuff, and you can build amazing technology. And that's where kind of the whole philosophy of science sort of became very marginalized in physics, which I think is kind of, as a physicist, I think the first thing you should be told is a crash course in the philosophy of science. But that didn't happen. So a lot of physicists are philosophically or metaphysically kind of ignorant, and they think philosophers are stupid and annoying because philosophy is kind of just this squabbling about ideas. So that's why very importantly, this idea of physicalism, like the metaphysical underlying, the underpinning thing. So at one point, you have to do metaphysics, because where physics stops, metaphysics begins. And that's if you start to talk about what things are, what's the nature of things, which you cannot prove or disprove. So at one point, you have to engage with philosophy. And this just happened pretty late for physicists, and that's why kind of the reigning metaphysical idea, physicalism, or it used to be called materialism, that's that everything is physical, that's the only thing that there is. If you look at the interactions of the small parts, you can understand everything. Consciousness, life, at one point we understand it. And only slowly now are we kind of like realizing that this is a metaphysical belief. There's nowhere in science, there's no equation telling you to adopt this. So there's many other metaphysical belief systems you can have, which are just as unprovable or provable as physicalism, but they will give you a very different way of how you would like look at the world. So unfortunately, this physicalism kind of went under the radar, and only now slowly rational, like scientifically thinking people realize, actually that's just like an add-on, a philosophical add-on. That's not part of science itself. So you're allowed to criticize that without sort of being branded like ignorant or irrational or anti-science. And the problem with that is it kind of tells you that this is all just random and purposeless and kind of this cosmic nihilism. And just grow up and deal with it. You're not special. There's like no purpose to anything. You die, that's it. And just grow up and deal with it. Which, of course, you can have this point of view, but maybe you should know that this is like one you choose, and there's others which say different things, and they're just as valid from like a knowledge perspective as physicalism. And that's why the hard problem where David Chalmers said, actually, how can non-mental stuff start to have mental properties? In 1994, today we're still discussing that. So in the philosophy of mind, there are like two totally diverging ideas. So you have the physicalists on the one side, and then you have like the panpsychists and the idealists on the other side who say, hey, it's all consciousness. And they're like, no, it's all physical matter. And they find each other's perspectives like ridiculous, and yeah, they really don't get on very well. And what's happened with the kind of the psychedelic renaissance, that we've realized, actually these banned substances have mental health effects and they have benefits, that philosophers were like, hey, maybe we should talk about this. So you have the philosophy of psychedelics as a new thing, where like this one philosopher of psychedelics says, if you're a philosopher of mind and you don't take psychedelics, it's like if you are a pianist and don't have a piano. This is like the thing you should be doing and like engaging with. And slowly, yeah, because it's like destigmatized, you're allowed to say, I've had a psychedelic experience and I want to think about this like as a philosopher, without people thinking that you're like some crazy person or just whatever, some junkie. And yeah, we talked a bit about artificial consciousness. So what does that even mean? And is consciousness only mediated by organic structures, or could this happen in silicon? And how will we even know, like, again, the problem of other minds, like how do I know you have like the thing going on that I have? Maybe I'm just hallucinating you, or this is a simulation, or solipsism. Maybe I'm the only thing that exists and everything else is just like happening in my mind. So yeah, we don't know. But that was like sort of setting up the journey a bit to where we're going. And looking at the history of psychedelics, it's like terrible in the West, like this huge blind spot. So until recently, I did not know that in the beginning, when Hinduism was starting to become a thing, this spiritual tradition, that they had soma, this psychedelic drink. I did not know that Plato was taking a psychedelic substance. Like no one ever talked about that in any philosophy class ever, which is like, yeah, because of this kind of hostility towards psychedelics, because they're drugs and they're bad. So kind of we have all this whole history, which, yeah, slowly now we are being taught about this. And especially like Plato, was he like telling us about his experiences that he was having on like psychedelic trips, like the allegory of the cave or this Platonic realm of absolute forms sounds very much like things that people who smoke DMT would like talk about. So maybe we should just like talk about that when we do Western philosophy. And also in shamanism, where like the one, so he's the historian Eliade, Mircea Eliade, he wrote a book about shamanism where he was kind of showing that there's like these universal themes happening everywhere across the globe in these shaman cultures, if it's whatever, in the tundra in Siberia, or if it's in the rainforest or in Africa. And he kind of showed that there was like this universal sort of technique and like culture happening at different times across the globe, which, yeah, he did it as a historian and not as an anthropologist, and they kind of got annoyed that he did that and ignored his book, but it still became kind of the standard on shamanism. And he was saying, as soon as shamans take mind-altering substances, they're decadent, because the true shaman does this with trance, and so again, like this hostility towards psychedelic experiences induced by substances, like really weird. Like, why would he, I don't know, like, what's the issue there? This is like from the very beginning, and if you study shamanism as he did, you kind of should think that, or realize that that's like the main point there. It doesn't really matter how you do it, it's that you do it. And then we have, yeah, kind of this talk on idealism last week. So this is kind of what's happening at the moment. There's this renaissance in idealism, which is weird, because idealism says consciousness is everything. So everything you see is derived from this field of consciousness, and as we talked about it last week, you can't really understand it rationally, because it just makes no sense. It's like non-duality, or kind of, these are trans-rational ideas, but you can experience them. And that's kind of what these shamans and mystics and meditators and psychonauts tell us about, that these are, you can experience cosmic consciousness, you can experience oneness, what it means, non-duality, to like merge with all of existence. These are experienceable states, reproducible, but you can't rationally kind of understand it. So that's kind of the problem with idealism, that you can't really, from a rational perspective, grasp it, and that's why it's kind of like had maybe a hard time sort of to sort of come back into the collective psyche, because in Germany we had a big wave of idealism with Kant and Hegel, Fichte, and all these guys, and Schelling. And then it was like, yeah, but that's kind of stupid, because it's like totally doesn't work with like what we're seeing in reality. But now with the philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychedelics, and with all these issues we're having with fundamental physics, we still don't know like how gravity and quantum mechanics go together. Maybe space-time is emergent. So people are now rethinking kind of these metaphysical foundations, and idealism is having a comeback.